activist. I am really delighted that Richard's agreed to speak. I'll just start with a quote from a recent article in the BMJ that he wrote. As it's budget day, it seems singularly appropriate. Economic growth is supposed to save Britain, but sadly it's more likely to destroy us. That's his provocative headline. And he points out, I'll go on, the central problem with our current formula for growth, which depends on extracting and destroying parts of the earth, is that it's unsustainable in a finite planet. And he goes on to advocate a degrowth model that will be better for our health and the planet. And that's why I want him to talk tonight. What's good for our health and the planet? Because there's no doubt in my mind that the climate emergency is a health emergency. And I'm not going to go over Richard's personal bio because that's been emailed to you. What I do want to quickly highlight is that after a sterling career as editor of the VMJ, he's now chair of the UK Health Alliance on Climate Change. And if you don't know what that is, I'm going to put the link in the chat because it's an absolutely brilliant organization, resource. It's an impressive body that actually is an alliance of most of the Royal Colleges, including my own, I'm glad to say, faculties, Students for Global Health, British Medical Association, Academy of Medical Sciences, Royal Society of Medicine, BMJ, and the Lancet. And its total membership, as I understand it, is 1 million health professionals, probably more. Its mandate is to advocate for a just response to the climate and ecological emergency and promote the health benefits that flow from those responses. And I'll let Richard detail more about that. But just to give you two good examples of very recent activity, they have called for an end to all subsidies, investments, new licenses, and consent for fossil fuels, while ensuring a just transition to new renewable energy. And really, this is amazing. They recently coordinated 250 health journals across the world to come together to publish an editorial urging world leaders to deliver climate justice for Africa ahead of COP27. This kind of joint action, which was actually led by journals in the Global South, is unprecedented. To end, I'm just going to quote from that article. Africa is united with other frontline regions in urging wealthy nations to step up, if for no other reason than the crisis in Africa will sooner rather than later spread and engulf all corners of the globe, by which time it may be too late to effectively respond. Richard is someone who understands the science of the climate crisis and its global health impacts, as well as the local one, and he works tirelessly to address them. So I'm really honoured and delighted that he's here to talk to us this evening. Thank you, Richard. Over to you.
Well, thank you very much. And thank you, people in Cornwall, for letting me have this opportunity to speak to you. Let me put up my, my PowerPoint here. You know, doctors, as perhaps you're aware, seem to be incapable of speaking without a PowerPoint. So I'm talking about health and the planetary crisis. It's going to take me about half an hour, and then I look forward to the discussion. Wait a minute, I've got to try and get this up to the whole screen. There it is. So I thought I would start with some of the comments made by the UN Secretary General at the opening of COP27 just over a week ago. We are in the fight of our lives and it looks like we're losing. Greenhouse gas emissions keep growing, global temperatures keep rising, and our planet is fast approaching a tipping point that will make climate chaos irreversible. And this is the quote that people heard time and time again. We are on a highway to climate hell with our foot on the accelerator. We can sign a climate solidarity pact or a collective suicide pact. So that was very strong stuff from the Secretary General, and the words he says get steadily stronger as the emergency gets ever more urgent. This is the UK Health Alliance, which Lynn just mentioned. And I should emphasize perhaps that it's, you know, these are the very respectable bodies in medicine. It's the College of Physicians, the College of Nursing, the College of Surgeons, all three of the Scottish colleges, the British Thoracic Society, paramedics, the Royal College of Psychiatry. So these, you know, this is the respectable end of the range of health organizations that work on climate change. And we're working to do everything we can to mitigate the crisis and to encourage adaptation, because the problem is already here. And we feel that we've not been as prominent in this debate as we should be, health professionals. It's only in the last 2 COPs that there has been some discussion of health. It just didn't feature at all in the first 25. And we're also working very much with the NHS for it to get to net zero. So as I'll explain to you, as well as being part of the solution, the health system is part of the problem. So climate change and the ecological crisis are both the major threat to global health. This is coming from both WHO and the Lancet, and also the greatest opportunity to improve global health. So we think that's one of the reasons that health is a good way into all of this, because it's not utterly bleak. There's a positive side to this. Although I'm going to talk primarily about climate change, I wanted to put up this slide from the Stockholm Resilience Centre, pointing out that we have many other environmental problems in the oceans, in soil, but I'm concentrating here primarily on climate change. And this, I think, is a good way of understanding the problem and understanding the tension that arises at COPs. So if everybody in the world live as people live in North America, with the amount they consume and the greenhouse gases they emit, we would need 5 planets. And of course, the reality is we've got only 1. If everybody in the world lived as we live in Western Europe, we would need 3 planets. The only people who are living in a sustainable way at the moment are people in the Asia Pacific region and in Africa. And that's for the simple reason that they're mostly poor people. Many of them don't have access to any electricity. They don't drive cars. They don't have fridges. They don't fly anywhere. That's not true, of course, of everybody who lives in those countries. And of course, those people, as this big arrow shows, want to have much of what we have. And if everybody, as I say, ends up like people in North America, we're absolutely doomed. So while we must allow people in Asia and Africa to develop, at the same time, we need to drastically cut our greenhouse gas emissions. And who produced the greenhouse gases? I hope you're perhaps familiar with these world mapper maps, which distort the planet in relation to whatever the issue is. And this is the places that emitted the greenhouse gases. So you see North America is huge, Europe is huge, and you see that gigantic island off the coast of Europe. Here is where the Industrial Revolution began. So that's who's produced the gases, who is suffering the most. And perhaps before I go to that, just let me draw attention to Africa. You can see it's a little thing hanging off the bottom of Europe, and most of that is South Africa. Almost all of sub-Saharan Africa disappears. And yet, if we look at the problem, it's exactly the reverse. Who is suffering the most from the problems of climate change? Well, it's people in Africa and Asia. And this is true here too. This is a slide we took from Michael Marmot, who perhaps is very well known in the health world, a global advocate of social determinants of health. And this is showing that exactly the same thing is true within Britain, that people who live in the most deprived areas, the least green areas, suffer the most from environmental problems, which is why many people see this whole issue as a matter of climate justice. It's a justice issue. So how does the climate crisis affect health? Well, it has very, very widespread effects, and it's here right now. Air pollution, which is a sort of related problem, and we have been concerned about air pollution for some time. But air pollution is killing about 7 million people a year around the planet. It's killing many thousands here in Britain. And I have to say that I think we, as health professionals, have not paid the attention to air pollution that we should have paid. We've somehow, we're very active on tobacco, but we've just not been as active on air pollution as we should. So this is it's a huge issue. And I mean, right at the moment in Delhi and Beijing, filthy, filthy air. Storms and wildfires. You've probably experienced wild storms in Cornwall. Not so many wildfires, but you probably have experienced some. And these are just going to get steadily, steadily worse if we don't respond to this problem. Floods and droughts. A third of Pakistan is still underwater. And yet in the summer, Pakistan had the most severe heat wave, killing tens of thousands. About 3,000 people were killed by the heat wave we had here in Britain when we went above 40 degrees for the first time ever. Luckily, that heat wave was very short, but if it had gone on for a week and lasted during the night, it would have killed many, many more. And that's what's going to happen with heat waves. They're going to become more intense and also last longer. And then we see extension of infectious disease, of malaria, dengue, Ebola, but also, I mean, the same thing, a sort of destruction of the planet is what's causing the pandemics. We've just experienced a pandemic. We will have other pandemics. And if we don't respond to the planetary crisis, they will come much, much more frequently than they have in the past. I mean, we've been having pandemics ever since people began to live in cities. And then the mental health damage. There's growing evidence on this. We were hearing a lot about it yesterday at a conference at the Royal College of Physicians and Surgeons in Glasgow, direct from WHO, but also, I mean, Lynn will be able to tell you, I'm sure, that lots of young people are feeling terrible distress from the plight of the planet, which in many ways is a rational way to feel, but it feels very, very uncomfortable. But actually, the things that most matter in terms of our harm health are these three things at the bottom. Shortage of land. We were hearing yesterday that lots of places that are no longer able to grow crops. I've spent a lot of time in Bangladesh. The Bay of Bengal is moving steadily north, drowning land so people can't grow it, but also filling the land with salt so that they can no longer grow rice. Result in shortages of food. We're hearing a lot about that now. We were hearing a lot at the conference yesterday about the destruction of crops. Most of the barley crop in Italy has been destroyed. And then water, with the droughts getting steadily worse. And of course, these things force people to move. If you can't feed yourself, you've got nothing to drink, then you're forced to move. And that is one of the big drivers of migration. And it's been estimated that something like 2/3 of a billion people are going to be forced into migration in the next 10, 20, 30 years if we don't respond adequately to this crisis. And then I suppose what I fear is the way it will finally play out as we fight over land and food and water and other resources will be with war. But here is the sort of upside. If we tackle this problem, we can improve health. So energy efficiency of homes, making them cheaper to heat. I mean, that improves both physical and mental health. Eating mostly plant-based rather than animal-based diets improves food security, it improves nutritional status and obesity, and it improves physical and mental health. It reduces the chances of cardiovascular disease and diabetes. Access to green and blue spaces. So trees cool city and reduce air pollution, and time in natural spaces reduces stress and health inequalities. So this is good for both physical and mental health. Walking and cycling more and driving less improves. I mean, exercise is the closest we come in health to a panacea. It's good for almost everything, for your brain, for your mood, for your heart, for your joints, for your lungs. And then building communities and helping communities respond to climate change. So by doing the things we need to do, we can improve health. So how should we be responding to the climate crisis, which is a health crisis? Well, I don't know how many of you have seen this Netflix film, which has a lot of A-list Hollywood stars in it. Don't Look Up, it's called. It's very funny, but it's also terrifying in the sense that these two astronomers on the right, they realize that a planet is heading directly towards Earth and is going to crash into the planet. And they try to get the attention of politicians and the media represented here, and they just can't do it. It's all too late eventually. It's a film, if you haven't seen it, I enjoyed it a lot. Well, enjoyed is a funny word, but it is successfully funny. And then also I was listening the other day to Jonathan Friedland talking on the radio about his new book, The Escape Artist, about the man who escaped from Auschwitz at the beginning of the war and tried to tell people what was going on there, and people just couldn't believe him. And Jonathan Friedland used this quote, which I think is applicable in these circumstances: we can't believe what we can't imagine. And I think that's one of the reasons we're not taking the action we should. So how best in broad terms to respond? Well, it can, if you spend whole days at conferences on climate change and the environment, it can feel very depressing, and you think, oh my goodness, we're doomed, there's nothing we can do, it doesn't matter. So you try to avoid and deny the problem, eat, drink and be merry, and stumble into anxiety and despair. The best way to respond is to do something, to recognize that you can make a difference. And I'm going to speak more about that, because there's a huge range of things you can do. And no matter how small, it all helps reduce greenhouse gas emissions and avert the crisis. And by taking action and encouraging others, it actually makes you feel better and more hopeful. So if you're feeling depressed about this, much better than to take drugs, and I'm sure Lynn will back me up on this, is to get out there and be active, to do something, to begin to make a difference. And this is, these are a whole lot of health professionals sat outside Downing Street. This is Doctors for Extinction Rebellion. And there are plenty of doctors that feel so strongly about this that they're willing to glue themselves to things, to be arrested. And we might talk more about that later. But I think it shows how strongly people feel about this. And to avoid serious damage that may spiral out of control, we need to try and stay below an increase of 1.5 degrees centigrade over the pre-industrial era. At the moment, we're about 1.2, between 1.2 and 1.3. And actually, it varies in different places in the planet. So in the Arctic, it's higher than that. I mean, I think the brutal reality is we're going to find it pretty well impossible to stay below 1.5. But every little bit of increase we make makes the problem a whole lot worse. So, we shouldn't give up on this. And where are we headed? Well, this comes from the Henley Center, thinking, what are the likely outcomes? Well, if we were begun to make a rapid decline in greenhouse gas emissions from 2010, then we might be headed towards 2.1 or 2.8. If the action is slower, then it's going to lead to higher increases. And I mean, if we carry on with business as usual, we're going to end up with something like a 5-degree increase. At that point, I mean, life, I think, would be intolerable, and there would be billions of deaths. So we really need to act on this urgently. And this is a sort of way of illustrating it from a doctor's point of view. So if you're at 37 degrees, your body, you're pretty healthy. If you're 2 degrees high, you're 39, then you're pretty sick. If you're 4 degrees higher, then you're in mortal danger. And at 5 degrees, it's maybe too late. So this again illustrates how the health of the planet and the health of us as individuals fits together. And this is really the picture at the moment in Britain, that we do have a target to get to net zero by 2050, but actually we don't have a target that would reduce us below 1.5. And of course, it's what happens in the whole planet that matters. It's not just what happens here in Britain. So there is an ambition gap. We don't actually have the targets we need. But then the really depressing thing is the delivery gap, that we are just not making the progress we need to make. It's just not coming down fast enough. And if you don't believe me, this is a point I wanted to make. It could all accelerate and get much worse because there are many potential feedback loops that could lead to things happening even faster, and things are happening faster than people thought they were going to happen 5 years ago, and they could happen very, very fast with some of these feedback loops. So we need action on a global level, a national level, at city and region, within health systems, and within organizations, including all of our members, and we've set them some tough targets, and as individuals. And as individuals, we as doctors need to change as professionals and as citizens. And we're really only going to have any chance of saving this if high-income countries make bigger cuts in carbon than is expected from low-income countries. Remember back to that diagram I showed you of the number of Earths we would need depending on how we live. High-income countries will have to provide financial and technical support to low-income countries. And back at the Copenhagen meeting many years ago, high-income countries promised 100 billion a year, but that has never yet been met. It's got up into the 80 billions, but not to 100. And now really trillions are needed, not billions, because we've been slow to act. And if you're looking at global performance, well, a lot of people get very cynical about the COP meetings that happen every year. I was at last year's one. I mean, some of them, people regard them as sort of jamborees where inadequate promises are made and then are not met. But we have to have a global process. And it's really all we have at the moment. And then you look at a national level, then a lot of the nationally determined contributions, which is what countries say they're going to do to reduce their greenhouse gas emissions, are still inadequate to keep us below 1.5. It's not written into the law in most countries. It is written into the law in Britain, and the countries are not on track to meet their targets, which are themselves inadequate, and it's becoming progressively harder. And this is Lord Deben, who you probably know better as John Selwyn Gummer, who is the chair of the Climate Change Committee. And he says the government's target is good, its policies are moderate, but implementation is woeful. The other day, he used the word appalling on the radio. So he's very blunt about this, and that's what he is there to do, because the Climate Change Committee must monitor progress and reports directly to Parliament. Just to pick out some of their annual report from this year, emissions did fall by 13% in 2021, but you'll remember that was a very unusual year when we were locked down for much of the time. An ambitious heat and building strategy that works for consumers is urgently needed and just isn't there at the moment. More than 20 million homes to have their heating system changed. There are delayed plans on surface transport, aviation, hydrogen, biomass, and they all need to be delivered. Plans for the power sector, industrial decarbonation in the North Sea must be strengthened. The big cross-cutting challenges of public engagement, fair funding, and local delivery must be tackled. And when it comes to adaptation, I mean, we're not doing well with mitigation, trying to keep greenhouse gas emissions down, but we're doing even worse with adaptation. So the report said that only 5 of 34 sectors assessed have shown notable progress in adaptation in 2 years, and no sector is yet scoring highly in lowering its level of risk. So we're The problem is already here and we're failing to adapt. So what would we, the UK Health Alliance, like to see from Parliament and from the government? Well, we'd like to see an improved NDC, nationally declared contribution, that would get us to net zero, and ideally by 2040, not by 2050. We'd like, and this is the bit that matters even more, that we have full implementation. Because unfortunately, it's easy to make promises. It's not that hard to draft policies. It's making it happen that's hard. And then we want to see the financial and technical assistance to vulnerable low and middle income countries. And we think that it needs to be beyond the 100 billion that is promised at the moment, but hasn't yet been delivered. We support the climate and ecology bill that has been introduced into Parliament. This is a plan for a new UK law that addresses the full extent of the climate and nature crisis. So you remember back, right at the beginning, I was making the point that this is a crisis not just in terms of the amount of greenhouse gases, but there are very many other issues relating to soil and the oceans. And that the bill is the only proposed legislation before the UK Parliament that ensures a comprehensive and joined up approach to the emergency. And then we would like, and we, the UK Health Alliance, have signed the Fossil Fuel Non-Proliferation Treaty, as have many hundreds of health organisations from around the world. We would like the government to sign it. So this calls for non-proliferation, preventing the proliferation of coal, oil and gas by ending all new explorations and production, a fair phase out, and a peaceful transition. We always have to remember this is an issue of justice and we mustn't punish the most vulnerable. And we would certainly like to see action on air pollution. We've been calling for this for a long time. So support the limits that were recommended by WHO to be reached by 2030. And actually, since they produced those limits, WHO has recommended still lower limits. So we want to see safe limits. I mean, people, we think, should be able to breathe clean air just as they expect to drink clean water. And this summarizes what it is that we're asking for, and I would add in access to green space. You probably noticed that a couple of weeks ago, just before COP began, the Lancet Countdown on Climate Change, which is funded by the Wellcome Foundation and produces sort of up-to-the-minute evidence on how well we're doing in response to all aspects of climate change. Well, together with the Royal College of Physicians, the BMA, the Royal College of Pediatrics and Child Health, we produce these policy recommendations off the back of that report. And we do that each year. So we look at the evidence and then make policy suggestions. And we are asking our members, we met together recently and we said, what should we be doing? Because we can't just ask others to do things, we need to be doing things. And I won't run through all of these, but I've picked out some in yellow. So we want our members to declare that the climate emergency is a health emergency, and actually many of them have done that. In fact, the 3 surgical colleges did it just a couple of days ago. We want them to publish a plan to get their organization to net zero, to monitor it and report it annually, and that will mean a lot of negotiating with suppliers. We want them to develop a plan to campaign on mitigating and adapting to the planetary crisis. We want them to disinvest from fossil fuels, and again, many of them have already done this, and we want them to acknowledge the link between the climate crisis and inequalities. Many of them, as I say, have done all of this. Our members are all at different stages, but we're going to ask each of them to commit to this and say by what time they will reach what we're asking them to do. And then changes in the health system. So I think this is a sort of summary of where health professionals in Britain are at. So every health professional is really aware that climate change is real and happening now, that there are no climate deniers among health professionals. People are seeing the direct impact of the climate change, the floods, the heat waves, the effects of air pollution, and they're aware of action that can be taken to reduce their own personal carbon footprint. Where I think there's more variable awareness is just how urgent this problem is and how much we need to really transform society in order to respond to it. People have been slow to catch on to the connection with health and healthcare itself, and people are still trying to work out what it means in their clinical role. But those 3 surgical colleges a few days ago not only committed themselves to declared the climate emergency as a health emergency, but also came up with a long list of things that surgeons can do, surgical teams, to cut their greenhouse gas emissions and to reduce waste. Now, globally, if healthcare were a country, it would be the 5th largest emitter on the planet, which is perhaps not surprising when you think that it's 10% of the economy here, it's nearly 20% of the economy in the US, and the US health system accounts for 12% of all carbon emissions from that country, and that's actually half of all emissions by all health systems. The NHS accounts for about 5% of UK carbon emissions, and 1 in 20 vehicles on the road in the UK is related to the NHS, which, again, when you think about it, is not so surprising. It's staff going to and from work, patients going to and from clinics, supplies being delivered. And this is a sad slide that comes from the Lancet Countdown. This shows that most health systems actually have increasing carbon emissions. And the one right at the top there is the US, which is an enormous, expensive, dysfunctional health system. But here's something to be proud of. This is a place where England, not unfortunately UK, but England is a genuine leader. So NHS England is the only health system in the world that has not just a commitment to get to net zero, but it has a plan, it has a chief sustainability officer, it has staff, it has funding, and it's committed to getting to net zero on everything it controls directly itself by 2040, with an 80% reduction by 2028 to 32. And then when everything it consumes, and as I'll show you in a minute, much of the carbon footprint of the NHS arises from procurement, the drugs and equipment that it buys. So that the aim is to get to net zero by 2045. And this plan was set in October 2020 during the pandemic, which was a bold move, but it's on track to get to net zero by 2000. The first year results showed that it was on track. And despite the fact that people in the health system are rather exhausted and overworked, and that people are very enthusiastic about this. People very much want to make this happen because health professionals realize just how serious this is. And this is what really every plan needs. And unfortunately, many plans don't have that. And this is the carbon footprint of the NHS. And one thing you should notice is that it's lots of different things. It's not just one thing. It's the buildings, it's water and waste, it's travel. And then the second thing to notice is that the blue here, that is all stuff that is procured. Drugs, equipment, food, etc. And so obviously it's the suppliers who are going to have to get to net zero, and the NHS England has a plan for making that happen. And the single biggest chunk is drugs. And something that may surprise you, but is well established and seen across the world, is that half of drugs that are prescribed are never actually taken for a whole variety of reasons. So there's lots of room there to improve prescribing of drugs, reduce antimicrobial resistance, and reduce greenhouse gas emissions. So again, you know, most of the things the NHS needs to do in order to get to net zero are things that will improve care. And this is the outline of the plan. I won't expect you to read all of that on the left. I just wanted to show you it in broad outline. A lot of it depends on preventing disease and reducing inequalities. And I mean, I joined the BMJ in 1979, and we've been talking about these things ever since then and from before, and unfortunately we've made very little progress. Anesthetic gases and inhalers are quite a big chunk, and there's been a lot of progress made already with reducing anesthetic gases. Inhalers is a bit trickier. Some people get with asthma and chronic obstructive pulmonary disease get very attached to their inhaler and they're reluctant to change it. But we are beginning to change people to low carbon inhalers, and pharmaceutical companies are racing each other to produce lower carbon inhalers. Then the digital care pathway redesign that happened a lot during the pandemic has the potential to reduce emissions dramatically, not just by meaning that people don't have to travel to clinics, but actually because it allows redesigning the whole pathway in a way I could explain later if you're interested. But a lot of this, I mean, nobody actually knows how to get a health system to net zero. So it's going to depend a lot on research and innovation. And then we're never going to get to absolute zero. I mean, Nick Watts, the NHS Chief Sustainability Officer, said we need to get down to about 8% of the carbon footprint now, and then that can be offset or sequestered. But you have to be very careful with offsetting or sequestering, because often it's greenwashing. So what can you do now? I thought, I mean, I'm sure many of you will be aware of this already, but I thought I would leave you something to do. You can move better. You can fly less, ideally not at all. I've given up flying. You can drive less. You can walk and cycle more. That'll be good for you. It'll be good for the planet. You can eat better. You can move from a high carbon diet, mostly an animal-based diet, to a low carbon diet. That'll be good for your health and it'll be good for the planet. And we were hearing a lot at yesterday's conference about food waste. You know, something like 15 to 20% of food is wasted, and that all ends up producing carbon. So there's a lot to be done there. You can buy better, buy less. I mean, consumption is our big problem in a way. If we could just consume less, repair things, not go out and buy new things, not buy so many clothes, so many electronic gadgets. Use your money, divest from fossil fuels, invest in sustainable goods and services. Practice better. This is aimed particularly at health professionals, obviously. Campaign better, join organizations, make political statements, and more health professionals are getting very active on this. When the UK Health Alliance started some 10, 15 years ago, and actually it was started by Prince Charles, I mean, well, now the King. Without him, we might have had trouble getting off the ground, but he was very involved in its starting. We had to work quite hard to persuade the colleges to join. And often they'd think, well, we've done our bit on climate change because we've joined the alliance. But now they're sort of competing with each other to do more and more. And then talk better about this issue as a health issue as well as an environmental issue. And I just wanted to share this with you to show that it is possible for an individual to make a pretty dramatic effect. So I took this from The Economist. So there on the left, you can see what was happening with flights from Stockholm Airport before 2017. They were going up by about 10% a month. And then a small young girl began to make her protest outside the Swedish Parliament every Friday there, week after week. And look what happened to flights from Stockholm Airport. They have begun to fall. It probably wasn't just Greta Thunberg, but it shows how you can make a difference as an individual. So if you'd like, I mean, we produce a monthly newsletter on all sorts of things that are happening with health and climate change. And if you'd like to sign up to that, we'd be delighted to have you. So thank you very much for listening to me, and I hope I haven't taken too long.
Thank you, Richard. You certainly haven't taken too long. I think we could have listened to you for another hour. And actually,
Well, then I'll do that.
I think, honestly, Richard, I think before we go any further, we should see if we can get you booked in again in 6 months or even a year's time, so you can actually talk about the progress. And it's fascinating to know that the NHS, I mean, it's a massive organisation. It's difficult to get anything working across the whole system, but for them to have that plan and that focus is good. Okay, let's go straight to questions because we have got about 15 minutes. So I just quickly go to the chat. Caroline, actually, I saw Caroline say a few things which you could work. Do you want to quickly touch on that? So, Richard, Caroline asked, will hospitals lead by example by providing plant-based food to patients? There was a tiny bit in your presentation around that. Did you want to say any more about that?
Yes, I mean, a lot of them are already doing that. I mean, one of the things that we, the UK Health Alliance, campaigned on was to have these limits, these targets that are set for the whole NHS, written into the Health and Care Bill. And they are written into the Health and Care Bill. They weren't there originally, but the government accepted that. And that requires every institution within the NHS to have a plan as to how it's going to get to net zero, which includes things like changing the food in hospitals. And they all had to publish their plan in this year, and NHS England is currently analysing all of the plans. And as you can imagine, you know, some are much further advanced than others. But, you know, there are all kinds of wonderful initiatives going on within the NHS. I mean, it's always been a problem for the NHS, and in fact, for every health system. If you look around, you see marvelous things going on, but they tend not to spread. So the challenge is to have this overall plan, and you would see lots of examples. In fact, examples going back years of hospitals that have changed their diets quite dramatically, changed their travel policy, been doing all sorts of things. So there, but again, it's variable. And, you know, it's something that in every community, as in Cornwall, something you can push for. You know, contact your local hospital and say, what's happening? Can I see your plan? It's a public plan. Just how good is it? And make suggestions on how it could be improved.
When Richard, I'll be brief, but when I sat on the Environment Audit Committee, the NHS presented a plan of getting all their buildings net zero by 2032. Do you know if that is still a thing? And because that's a massive ambition. Yes,
I mean, I heard Nick Watts, who is the NHS Chief Sustainability Officer, who's a wonderfully inspirational leader. I mean, he's a doctor from emergency medicine, and he was talking yesterday, and he said, I mean, although they do have funding, because like I emphasize, you know, you can't expect people to do anything without any funding. He thinks that 7 billion will be enough to reduce about 80% of the emissions, which does, of course, involve changing buildings. But if you looked at that plan, you might imagine that the buildings are a sort of huge part of the footprint, but in reality, they're not. I think it's taken people a while to recognize that it's the clinical activity is the driver of the footprint, not the buildings. And in some ways, it's easier to get the buildings to net zero, although it does require some investment. Obviously, we've got a lot of very elderly hospitals, as people will well know. But there is real progress being made there.
Yeah, thank you.
I want to emphasize, actually, the thing about NHS England, it's actually had something called the Sustainable Development Unit for some 12 years. So there have been people working on this. A good friend of mine led it for many years, and it was a thankless task to begin with. But it's because of that background that NHS England is doing so well. And we had people from WHO presenting yesterday, and they hold up NHS England as a global example. And there are something like 60 other health systems now that have committed either to getting to net zero or to being climate resilient. But a lot of those are starting from scratch. You know, they've no plan. They're not really very clear what they're going to do. And so NHS England is working with WHO to offer advice to all these other systems.
Great. Lynn is going to ask a question about healthcare workers. Lynn, sorry, you're muted.
Derek, there were a couple of questions before me about plant-based diets and things. I didn't want to jump in front of them.
We've briefly touched on this. Richard's
Okay.
kind of tackled that.
All right. So no, I want it because about 7 of my friends were acquitted in City of London Magistrates Court yesterday for the misapplication of a Section 14. I just wondered what your view was about doctors engaging in non-violent civil disobedience.
Well, I recognize, I mean, that's why I showed that slide. You know, we've got people who feel very passionate about this. I mean, I have been on some Extinction Rebellion. I haven't been arrested. And it's obviously, I emphasize that we are the respectable end, as it were, all these royal colleges and such like. So it's, whereas, you know, we might fully appreciate individuals who are members of those colleges, because all those doctors will be, you know, going that far, it's not really possible for us to condone breaking the law. We would, I mean, I think in fact, we haven't even gone as far. We were talking to the GMC, General Medical Council, about all sorts of issues, particularly about changing medical education so that climate change is brought much more into medical education. And I think we would certainly encourage the GMC to be lenient, because obviously if a doctor is committed of a criminal offence, that then gets reported to the GMC and raises the possibility of a doctor being struck off. So, you know, we don't publicly condone people breaking the law, but we recognise exactly why people are doing it, and we would urge the GMC, if they appear before the GMC, to be lenient.
Richard, you're on that kind of note about how you engage in a way that you can more easily. I'm talking about those organisations that you talked about, the GMC, etc. How do you have access, and do you contribute to the Committee on Climate Change? You mentioned Lord Devon, but also presumably Jeremy Hunt will be fairly receptive to what you're saying.
Yes, I mean, we send a lot of letters to, we wrote to Alok Sharma. Every single one of our colleges signed a letter to Alok Sharma that we sent immediately before COP, saying what we wanted to see. We've written to Rishi Sunak. I mean, you'll know as well as I do that it's, you know, it takes a long time to get a response, and it doesn't mean very. I mean, I've met with Jeremy Hunt in the past. I knew him when he was Health Secretary, and yes, I mean, we would welcome an opportunity to be able to talk to them directly. You saw that I had included there, you know, things that we would like to see Parliament do, and we did have Lord Deben came and spoke to our council, and that was when he used the word woeful. He was very.
I listened to the quote or the interview that you quoted, and I quoted it again in Parliament last Wednesday. So it's obviously got around that particular comment on Radio 4. But can I was just thinking about Jeremy Hunt, because everyone knows, particularly politicians, MPs, that it's the Chancellor that holds all the purse strings, and nothing happens in government. Even if the Prime Minister wants it, it's always got to be the Chancellor's got to give it that permission. So actually, if you enjoy a good relationship with Jeremy Hunt, then you're actually in a brilliant position. And I'll have a word with him. I know him fairly well, so I'll have a word with him and try and put you in contact again.
Yeah, I mean, I've met him a few times, and one place where we have a lot in common, something I've been very concerned about for sort of 30, 40 years, is safety of healthcare. Yeah. Again, we were very slow to recognise how, you know, dangerous healthcare can be. And Jeremy Hunt was really the first Secretary of State ever to make that a priority. And actually, you can see this is a safety issue in a way. I mean, something I didn't mention, I mean, something like 10% of the hospitals in England are very vulnerable to flooding. You know, but also what's happening in the hospital. I mean, heat waves and such, you can see it as a safety issue. So maybe that would be a way to engage him. Well, we'd be delighted to meet with him if we had the opportunity, and we could bring some of our presidents. Again, it used to be that the presidents of our colleges, we have to work quite hard to get them to be involved, but now they're almost beginning to compete with each other. We all did a ride through the centre of London a couple of weeks ago, and we had lots of presidents on that, and there's a thing called Ride for Our Lives. A lot of young doctors last year rode all the way from London to Glasgow for the beginning of COP. I did the first leg, which was 65 miles through the children's. I must say I was pretty knackered by the time I got to Oxford. But they went on all the way.
Pippa, have you got anything you want to ask Richard?
I see someone holding a hand.
I noticed, yes, 16 JFD, a gentleman has his hand up.
Oh, sorry, I can't see that.
16 FJD. Right, would you like to ask your question?
I don't know whether you're talking to me because
yes, I'm sorry, it's a lady. I couldn't see very well.
It looks like, is it Jean and Fran there, I think?
Yes, it's
Mary, did you?
First of all, I just want to thank the professor for his talk, but I've got 4 very quick questions. Do you and your UK Health Alliance use algorithms for the estimate of what's happening in the future? That's number 1. Number 2 is the CO2 emissions is 1% of the global use in the UK compared with China's 35 plus. And you said at a point in your talk that we've reduced that by 13%. So I'm thinking it's 13% of 1%, which I don't know. I'm not very good at maths, so I'd like to know that answer. And then number 3 is the Hippocratic Oath appears to be being dropped by GPs and doctors for the sake of community benefit, which I think, I personally think that's very regrettable, but I'd like you to answer that. And the other is, the last one is, do you personally believe in evolution?
Well, I certainly believe in evolution. I mean, it's not a matter of belief as far as I'm concerned, it's a fact.
Okay, thank you.
So that's these, I mean, in terms of evidence, you can imagine that this is very, very important to us as doctors and professionals. So we don't tend to produce much evidence ourselves, but we go to the Intergovernmental Committee on Climate Change, to WHO, to all sorts of scientific sources. I mean, we do not produce the information ourselves, but we analyze and use the information that they have produced. I mean, you're right that, of course, although Britain in the past has produced a lot of the greenhouse gases, now, I mean, to be honest, what happens with us is not going to make that much difference. As you say, it's what happens in China, India, the US. These are the really big emitters, which is why we do put some of our effort into global activity. Lynn talked about the editorial that we published, which was published in 260 journals, including the Chinese Science Bulletin, the National Medical Journal of India, the New England Journal of Medicine, which is arguably the world's leading medical journal, JAMA, which is the Journal of the American Medical Association, the Lancet, the Medical Journal of Australia. So it was, we do, and we are part, in fact, we are founder members of the Global Climate and Health Alliance, and we sit on the board of the Global Climate and Health Alliance. So you're absolutely right that we've got to work with other countries, and really that's the point I was trying to emphasize, that we will not be able to do it on our own. We can only do it through global cooperation. And that does mean, difficult as it might be, transferring funds and support to poorer countries. And then it's good that you bring up the Hippocratic Oath, because I think that, it's the famous bit is first do no harm.
Yes,
And of course, that's unfortunately what a lot of health systems are doing. So we must do something about that. And generally, there's not a trade-off between what's good for the individual and what's good for the planet. So increasingly, GPs will bring up in consultations, the climate crisis. They know that many of the people they're seeing are very anxious about this. So if someone comes in with a respiratory problem, they would always have spoken to them about tobacco. Now they'll speak to them about air pollution. I mean, it's still not happening on a big scale, but that's the way we're beginning to go, and explaining, where air pollution is coming from and what might be done about it and what the individuals can do to avoid it. If they've got cardiovascular disease or diabetes, then you talk about your diet and how much you exercise and how that will be good for you, but it'll also be good for the planet. If people have got a mental health problem, you might talk about using nature as a response, not just drugs. And again, you can then relate it to the climate. So I think that's happening increasingly. And I think it's quite difficult when you first start, but there are quite a lot of doctors who've been doing it for a long time now and find that people are very responsive. I think I answered your questions.
May I just reply to the Hippocratic Oath?
Yes.
Because the person who has the sickness, it's very important then that the doctor considers them more than the community. And so I personally don't agree with that loosening of the Hippocratic Oath. And I would stand up probably for 17 million people in Britain.
But what I'm arguing is that there's rarely, on the whole, what's good for the patient will also be good for the planet and the system. There's not yet a trade-off. I mean, you may be right as we get further on that there could be some kind of trade-off, and that will be more. But as we say to some of our members, no planet, no general practice. I mean, that's the reality.
I think that's definitely a topic for a future visit, Richard, if you want it. Pippa, did you want to, we ought to bring it to close, Pippa. Did you have a question or something you wanted to just...
Well, I wondered if do we have 2 minutes just to bring in Mary Fletcher, who's talked about the disaster of cutting overseas aid, and now there's the whole question of loss and damage, which probably would take more than 2 minutes to discuss. But Mary, I know you wanted to comment on that.
Yeah, I just wanted Richard to comment on whether lessening our aid is going to have a bad effect. It's already so tiny, 0.7%. Anyway.
No, well, I mean, I was trying to emphasize that in my talk, and you could, in terms of helping these countries do what they need to do to reduce their greenhouse gases, adapt their economies, adapt to the challenges they're already facing. I deliberately didn't use the phrase loss and damage, which I think we were hearing yesterday seems to have been put on one side at COP, although it's one of the big issues. But simply in terms of sort of justice and humanity, I think but ultimately, I mean, we need to do it for our own sake, because we just will not be able to stay below 1.5 or even below 2 if we do not help these other countries. If they, say, well, to hell with you, we'll carry on burning coal because we don't have any renewable energy. We were seeing data yesterday on just how rare renewable energy is in low and middle income countries, often depending on coal, and that's bad for all of us. And of course, as their economies disintegrate and they can't grow food, then they're forced to migrate and they end up in the channel. And so this is actually in our own self-interest, I would argue. So I think you can You can argue this in various ways.
Can I pick up on that? Because it's a really good point. And I don't think it's just about the money. We all signed, so 192 countries, UN countries, signed the Sustainable Development Goal commitments back in 2016. I think it was about then. We're supposed to deliver those by 2030. And there's quite a bit in there about climate change, about renewable energy, clean water. Yeah. And so my frustration, and I've raised it a few times in Parliament, is that it just doesn't seem to be on anyone's agenda, and there's no one department leading on it. And it's if it's not happening here in the UK, and it's supposed to apply to both the UK and all the other, our responsibility is what we're doing here, but what we're doing for the other 191. If we're not taking a lead on it here, it's very difficult to see how other countries can be expected to take a lead on it as well. But the Sustainable Development Goals, I mean, if people haven't looked at them recently, there's 17 goals there. And if we were to deliver that, we'd be living in a very different planet. Pippa, I still want to bring you in to finish, please.
Well, I'd just like to say thank you very much indeed to Richard for coming and talking to us. I very much hope you will come back in 6 months and tell us about progress. And there was so many things that I hadn't understood about where the climate emissions from the NHS come from. So the whole thing is it's opened up many doors for me, and I'd like to thank you very much.
Good. Well, thank you very much for giving me the opportunity to talk to you. You know, we're keen to talk to everybody everywhere, as you could see on my list of things you can do. So thank you very much.
Thank you. It's really comprehensive.
Thank you. And thanks, Derek. Thanks, Lynn.
Thanks, everybody.
Bye-bye.
Thank you. Before people do rush off, we'll send out the information, but it's December, it's going to be on a Wednesday, and it's going to be asking you to speak for 2 minutes about how you can make your Christmas much greener and much healthier. So you've got to work. There's no such thing as a free lunch, or you're not going to get lunch. But you're going to, having had speakers all year, we want you to talk for 2 minutes about what kind of changes you can make in your own home, or are making, to be less, taking more out of the planet, as Richard started with. Brilliant. Thanks ever so much, everybody. Take care.
Thank you. Bye.